The third of the month always arrived with a breath of decay. It wasn't a calendar date for Elias anymore. It was a texture, a scent, a specific shade of gray that painted the world. For 2 years, since the day he had laid his daughter, Lily, to rest in the cold earth of Blackwood Necropolis, the third had been his pilgrimage. Tonight, the wind was a predator. It didn't just blow, it scoured. It swept down from the barren hills surrounding the cemetery, a physical presence that howled through the iron filigree of the main gate. The sound was a low, guttural moan, the lament of something ancient and hollow. As Elias pushed the heavy gate open, its shriek of rusted hinges was swallowed by the gale. The wind carried a complex perfume, the damp, loamy smell of turned soil, the sharp, almost metallic scent of imminent rain, and underneath it all, a cloying sweetness, like flowers left to rot for far too long. Rain began to fall. It wasn't a drizzle. They were fat, heavy, and cold drops, striking his worn leather jacket with audible smacks, like 1,000 tiny pebbles. Each drop that found his skin, on his neck or his hands, was a needle prick of ice, a stark reminder of the world's indifference. The path ahead was a slick ribbon of mud and gravel, flanked by leaning headstones that seemed to shrink away from his presence. He wasn't alone. He never was. Through the thickening mist, he could see them. The others, 3 figures, motionless as the granite angels they stood beside. There was the old woman in the far east corner, always near the mausoleum of a long-forgotten industrialist. There was the tall, gaunt man who stood beneath the weeping willow, its branches lashing in the wind like tortured limbs. And there was the young woman, always near the children's section, a place Elias couldn't bear to look at for too long. They never acknowledged him. They never acknowledged each other. It was an unspoken covenant of grief. Every third of the month, they would appear at dusk, stand their silent vigils, and disappear before the first hint of dawn. Elias clutched the small, wilted daisy in his hand, Lily's favorite. He walked towards the small, simple stone bearing her name. The wind tried to rip the fragile flower from his grasp. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp, tracing cold paths down his spine, a baptism of sorrow he endured month after month. He knelt, the cold mud soaking through his jeans, and placed the daisy at the base of the stone. As he did, he glanced towards the tall man under the willow. The wind was whipping the man's long coat ferociously, but the man himself, he didn't sway. He didn't even seem to feel the cold. He was as still and silent as the grave markers around him. The ritual was always the same. Arrive at dusk, place the flower, whisper her name into the wind, endure the cold, leave. But tonight, something was different. The stillness of the tall man had burrowed into Elias's mind like a splinter of ice. It wasn't the stoicism of grief. It was something profoundly unnatural. He decided to wait. Instead of turning back towards the shrieking gate, he found shelter behind a large granite crypt, its stone walls offering a meager shield from the relentless wind. From this vantage point, he could observe the others. The rain intensified, coming down in punishing sheets that should have soaked anyone to the bone in minutes. Elias could feel the dampness seeping into his collar, the chill settling deep in his marrow. He watched the old woman. The wind tore at her black shawl, but her gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, did not have a single strand out of place. The rain, which hammered on the marble roof of the mausoleum she stood by, seemed to slide off her form like water off oil. leaving her eerily untouched. He squinted, his eyes stinging from the wind. It was an illusion, surely, a trick of the failing light in the swirling mist. His gaze shifted to the young woman near the children's section. She was wearing a simple, thin dress, utterly inadequate for the weather. Yet, she stood with a placid stillness, her head bowed. She didn't shiver. She didn't hug herself for warmth. The rain that struck Elias with physical force seemed to pass through her, or perhaps around her. She was a statue carved from sorrow. The wind changed its song. The low moan deepened into something more articulate, a sound filled with whispers that flirted at the edge of his hearing. He couldn't make out words, but the cadence was hypnotic, ancient. The smell on the wind intensified too. The scent of rot was now mingled with an ozonic, electric tang. The smell of the air after a lightning strike, even though there was no thunder. It was the smell of power. Elias's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of the storm. This wasn't a shared space for the grieving. He had been wrong. This was a stage, and the performance was about to begin. He was merely an audience member who had overstayed his welcome. He saw the tall man finally move. It was not a human motion. He didn't walk. He glided over the sodden ground, his feet leaving no impression in the mud. He moved towards the center of the cemetery, a small barren patch where no grass ever grew. The other two figures turned in perfect silent synchronicity and began to glide towards the same spot. Terror was a cold, sharp thing in Elias's throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee the shrieking gate and never look back. But the sight before him was transfixing, a terrible and mesmerizing ballet. He pressed himself harder against the cold granite of the crypt, feeling its dampness leach the heat from his body. The three figures converged on the barren patch of earth. They stood in a triangle, their heads bowed. The wind, which had been a chaotic gale, now seemed to focus on this one spot. It swirled around them, a contained cyclone of leaves and mist and whispered syllables. It was no longer the smell of rain and rot. It was the smell of dust and forgotten time, of ancient cellars and brittle bone. Then the ground began to change. From the barren earth, a faint phosphorescent light began to glow, a sickly green-white luminescence that pulsed in time with the unheard whispers on the wind. Elias watched, his breath caught in his lungs as the offerings left on the graves began to react. Not just his daisy, but the small toys, the faded photographs, the single roses left by other daytime mourners. A thin, ethereal tendril of light, like a wisp of smoke, lifted from his daughter's gravestone. It snaked through the air, drawn from the essence of the daisy he had just placed. It wasn't the flower itself that was moving, but something from it. The grief, the love, the memory he had poured into that simple object. The tendril drifted through the rain, untouched by the water, and was drawn towards the glowing triangle. As it reached the center, it was consumed by the light, which flared brightly for a moment before dimming again. He looked around in horror. From dozens of graves, similar tendrils of light were rising. A small, faded teddy bear in the children's section released a bright, innocent wisp. A weathered photograph on an old tombstone bled a long, mournful strand of silver light. The entire cemetery had become a garden of glowing, ethereal threads, all flowing inexorably towards the three figures. This was their purpose. This was the ritual. They weren't mourners, they were harvesters. They were feeding on the echoes of sorrow. the spectral residue of love left behind in this desolate place. The third of every month was their feast day. As the last tendril of light was absorbed, the central glow faded. The figures stood motionless for a moment longer. Then the tall man lifted his head. In the gloom, Elias couldn't see a face. There was only a smooth, pale oval, devoid of features that seemed to turn and look directly at the crypt where he was hiding. There was no sound, but a thought, cold and sharp, pierced Elias's mind. The offering is not enough. The witness is also a meal. Panic, pure and primal, finally broke the chains of his paralysis. Elias didn't even register the act of running. One moment he was pressed against the tomb, the next he was scrambling, slipping in the mud, his lungs burning with icy air. He didn't dare look back. The wind now seemed to claw at him, its whispers turning into mocking, hungry hisses. The shriek of the gate as he tore it open and slammed it shut behind him was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He ran until the cobblestones of the town were beneath his feet, until the muted glow of a street lamp offered a pathetic shield against the immense darkness he had just witnessed. He didn't stop until he was behind the locked door of his small apartment, his back pressed against it, his body racked with tremors that were not from the cold. He had not just been a mourner, he had been a farmer. For 2 years, he had faithfully tended his crop of grief, bringing it to the harvesters on the 3rd of every month. His love for his daughter had been used as sustenance for things that defied reason. The thought was a violation so profound it left him feeling hollowed out, scoured clean. The next month came. The 2nd day of the month was a torment of indecision. But on the morning of the 3rd, Elias knew he could not go back. He could never go back. He stayed in his apartment, the curtains drawn, jumping at every gust of wind. But as dusk fell, a strange thing happened. A breeze found its way through the sealed frame of his window. It was faint, but unmistakable. It carried the scent of damp earth, of decaying flowers, and of something else. The electric, ozonic tang of power. He stood in the center of his living room, miles from Blackwood Necropolis, and realized the truth. They knew he was missing. They knew their offering was incomplete. He is a free man, but he is also haunted. He can never again feel the wind without parsing it for those familiar, terrible scents. He can never again see the rain without feeling the memory of those icy, accusatory drops. And every month, on the evening of the 3rd, the scent gets a little stronger, a little closer. He is no longer a farmer tending his crop, but a crop that has run from the field. And he knows, with a certainty that freezes the blood in his veins, that the harvesters are patient, and eventually they will come to collect.